Imagine an entire country's power grid going dark, its hospitals losing power, its cities plunged into blackout, its water supply cut off. This isn't science fiction. This is a scenario that, right now in the Middle East, is edging dangerously close to becoming reality. U.S. President Donald Trump has issued a blunt warning. If Iran does not return to the negotiating table, America will strike Iran's power plants and bridges. This doesn't sound like an empty threat anymore, because behind it sits 5 months of active war, a ceasefire that collapsed, and a near-daily drumbeat of missile strikes on both sides. In this video, we're going to break down exactly how this war started, why the ceasefire fell apart, what it would actually mean to target Iran's power plants, why that specific act is being called a potential war crime, and what the ripple effects would be for the rest of the world if this strike actually happens. Stay until the end, because in the final part, we'll talk about what could realistically happen in the days ahead. To understand where we are today, we have to go back to February 28, 2026. On that day, the United States and Israel launched a massive joint military operation inside Iran. In roughly 12 hours, more than 900 airstrikes were carried out. The targets included Iran's missile sites, air defense systems, and military infrastructure. And, in the biggest shock of all, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed in the operation. This wasn't just a military strike. It was a direct hit on the entire leadership structure of Iran. And, predictably, Iran did not stay quiet. It responded with missile and drone attacks against Israel, against U.S. bases, and against U.S. allied countries across the Middle East. But the biggest response of all was the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Let's pause here and understand why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much. It's the waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's total oil and gas shipments pass. When Iran shut it down, a fuel crisis rippled across the globe. Several parts of Asia faced fuel shortages, and the shockwaves hit the global economy directly. What followed was a new phase of the conflict, the Strait of Hormuz air campaign. Starting March 19, 2026, the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Navy, and Israeli Air Force combined forces in an aerial campaign targeting Iranian naval assets, aiming to reopen the strait. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, broadcast warnings over VHF radio telling ships that no vessel was allowed to pass through the strait. The British Royal Navy said the closure wasn't technically legally binding, but that safety could not be guaranteed. So many ships simply turned back or stayed docked in port. By early April, Trump issued his first explicit warning that if Iran wanted to protect its infrastructure, specifically naming power plants and bridges, it needed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. On April 7th and 8th, after 5 weeks of fighting, the U.S. and Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire, brokered with Pakistan's mediation. For the first time in over a month, the U.S. didn't carry out widespread strikes, and Iran didn't strike U.S. targets either. But this ceasefire was fragile from the start. Iran began charging ships more than $1 million in tolls just to pass through the strait. The Islamabad talks that were meant to formalize a broader deal collapsed, and by April 13th, the U.S. Navy had reimposed its own naval blockade on Iranian ports. Then, on June 14th, mediators announced a new development, a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, intended to formally end the conflict within 60 days. The presidents of both countries signed it on June 17th. That deal didn't hold for long either. Just over a week after signing, Iran launched a drone strike on a ship in the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. interpreted this as a ceasefire violation and responded with limited retaliatory strikes. A pattern took shape. Iran would hit commercial shipping, the U.S. would respond with contained strikes, and Iran would then strike U.S. allies in the Gulf, particularly Bahrain and Kuwait. This pattern repeated for weeks, until everything changed. On July 8th, speaking at the NATO summit in Turkey, Trump renewed his threat, this time going even further. He said that, if necessary, the U.S. could target Iran's electric plants and desalination plants, the facilities that produce clean drinking water. His exact words were that he didn't want to do it, but that if they had to, they would take them out. Here's something crucial to understand. Deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure, like power plants and water plants, can be considered a war crime under international law. That same week, U.S. cruise missiles struck near a bridge in Iran's Golestan province, roughly 900 miles from the Strait of Hormuz, showing that the strikes were no longer confined to the waterway itself. On July 9th, another major incident occurred. A U.S. projectile struck an area near Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant, close to a fishing pier, setting boats on fire, according to the province's deputy governor. At the same NATO summit, Trump declared the MOU officially over and used harsh language to describe Iran's leadership. By July 13th and 14, the U.S. had reimposed its naval blockade on Iranian ports, the same blockade that had been in effect from April through June. Around this time, U.S. Central Command's Admiral Brad Cooper released a statement saying that over the previous 7 days, Iran had deliberately targeted civilians by attacking 7 commercial ships, leaving nearly a dozen crew members dead, missing, or injured. He added that Iranian forces had also launched dozens of missiles and drones toward neighboring Gulf countries. In the same period, Trump repeated on Fox News that unless Tehran returned to the table, the U.S. would strike Iran's bridges and power plants next week. He added that if Iran didn't make a deal, it wouldn't have anybody left. This isn't the first time Trump has threatened power plants and bridges. He's made similar threats before, often as a negotiating tactic without following through. But each time, the threat has come a little closer to becoming reality. Separately, a U.S. strike in southern Iran reportedly killed 3 members of a park ranger's family, according to Iran's foreign ministry. Now let's talk about the week things escalated most sharply. On July 15th, the U.S. targeted Iran's coastal defense systems and cruise missile storage sites, particularly on Greater Tumb Island. According to Central Command, the strikes began at 6 a.m. that day. This wasn't a single strike. It was a 7-hour campaign involving fighter aircraft, drones, and naval vessels, launching precision munitions against dozens of targets, aimed at degrading Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping and civilian crews. Iran didn't stay silent either. The IRGC announced it had struck the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, along with U.S. military assets in Kuwait and Jordan. The spokesperson for Kuwait's Ministry of Defense confirmed that its armed forces intercepted 4 cruise missiles and 21 drones fired from Iran, causing material damage to several facilities but no reported casualties. Later that evening, the U.S. concluded another wave of strikes at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, targeting Iranian command centers, air defense sites, missile and drone capabilities, and coastal surveillance facilities. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, Iran's health ministry says at least 35 people have been killed and more than 300 injured since fighting resumed. This is not just a threat sitting in the air anymore. It's an active, ongoing military campaign where people are dying every week and where each new statement pushes the escalation a little further. Now to the biggest question. What would it actually mean if the U.S. carries out a full strike on Iran's power plants? First, understand that power plants are civilian infrastructure. That doesn't mean they have zero military relevance. Military bases, hospitals, and water treatment plants all depend on electricity. But their primary purpose is to supply power to the civilian population. Under international humanitarian law, deliberately targeting infrastructure that isn't directly used for military operations can constitute a war crime. That's exactly why, when Trump raised this threat at the NATO summit, multiple reports noted that targeting civilian infrastructure like water and power plants could be considered a war crime. If Iran's major power plants, including facilities like Bushehr, which has already been struck once, were targeted at scale, the consequences would ripple out well beyond the military sphere. Hospitals would struggle to operate, particularly intensive care units and life support systems. Water treatment and sewage systems could fail, raising the risk of disease outbreaks. Ordinary daily life, cooking, cooling, communication, would grind to a halt, especially in a country where summer temperatures are already extreme. And Iran's economy, already strained by the Strait of Hormuz crisis, could collapse further. There's another critical detail here. Bushehr isn't just any power plant. It's Iran's nuclear power facility. If strikes continue to land near facilities like this, there's also a risk of radiation leakage, a danger that wouldn't just threaten Iran, but the entire region. Back in March, Israel struck Iran's Khandab heavy water complex and the yellowcake production plant in Ardakan. The International Atomic Energy Agency's Director General, Rafael Grossi, called for military restraint at the time specifically to avoid the risk of a nuclear incident. Now let's zoom out to the global level. What happens to the rest of the world if this escalation continues? The most immediate and direct impact is on oil and gas prices. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas passes through the Strait of Hormuz. And whenever tension rises in this waterway, global fuel prices react almost instantly. When Iran closed the strait earlier this year, several parts of Asia experienced fuel shortages within days. If a full-scale war breaks out that includes strikes on power plants, shipping companies may reroute entirely, insurance costs could spike, and global supply chains would come under massive strain. The second major impact would be a humanitarian and refugee crisis. If power and water supplies in Iran's urban centers collapse, millions of people could be forced to migrate, either within the country or toward neighboring states. The international community is already divided on how to respond. France convened a call with 35 countries specifically to plan for reopening the Strait of Hormuz once hostilities end, though officials were careful to stress that this initiative is strictly defensive and separate from any ongoing military operations. On top of all this, Iran has also struck British military facilities in Cyprus, the Indian Ocean, and Iraq, targeting bases that were supporting U.S. operations. This shows that the conflict is no longer confined to the U.S. and Iran alone. It has become a wider regional and international issue. There's an important nuance here that a lot of coverage tends to skip. Trump has threatened to strike power plants and bridges before, in April and even earlier, and each time he set a deadline, but a full-scale strike never actually followed. Many analysts view this as a negotiating tactic, a way of applying maximum pressure to force Iran back to the table. But this time feels different in a few specific ways. For the first time, an actual U.S. projectile has landed near the Bushehr nuclear plant. For the first time, Trump has declared the MOU completely over. And for the first time, both sides are exchanging strikes at a frequency and intensity that suggests the earlier pattern of contained, limited exchanges has genuinely broken down. That's exactly why analysts around the world are taking this particular threat more seriously than previous ones. Until both countries find a way back to the negotiating table, the risk of further escalation keeps climbing. Iran, for its part, has made clear it isn't backing down. The IRGC has threatened to shut off more of the region's energy exports, a move that wouldn't just hurt Iran, but could deal a serious blow to other Gulf oil exporting nations too. Iran's position has consistently been that a ceasefire is only possible once attacks against it stop completely. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, has repeated this stance multiple times, but trust between the two sides has eroded so much that any new ceasefire attempt looks just as fragile as the last one. To fully understand how we got here, it helps to zoom out even further because this tension didn't appear overnight. The hostility between the US and Iran goes back decades. In 2015, a nuclear deal known as the JCPOA was signed, under which Iran agreed to limit its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. That deal eventually collapsed, and every attempt to negotiate a replacement has failed since. Alongside that, Iran's ballistic missile program and its growing military reach across the Middle East have long worried the US and its allies, particularly Israel. All of this combined to create an environment where it took just one spark to ignite a full-blown war. And that spark came on February 28, 2026, when the US and Israel targeted Iran's top leadership directly. Since then, nearly every month has brought a new round of escalation, a new ceasefire attempt, and a new collapse. This war has also activated diplomacy well beyond the two main combatants. Pakistan mediated the ceasefire back in April through what became known as the Islamabad talks, though the results didn't hold for long. Qatar and Oman have both remained active in back-channel diplomacy. Oman's role is especially significant because a large portion of the Strait of Hormuz sits within Iranian and Omani territorial waters, meaning any naval blockade or military operation directly affects Oman as well. France led a separate initiative with several allied nations focused purely on how to reopen the strait once hostilities end, while stressing that this planning was defensive and not a military intervention. The International Atomic Energy Agency has also kept close watch on the conflict, particularly whenever strikes occur near Iran's nuclear sites, repeatedly warning that a miscalculation could trigger a nuclear incident affecting the entire region. So let's think ahead. If the US does follow through and strikes Iran's major power plants, what could actually happen next? One possibility is limited, symbolic strikes. The US targeting one or two specific facilities, similar to what's already happened, sending a message that it's serious without causing a mass civilian blackout. A second, more dangerous possibility is a full-scale infrastructure campaign, multiple major power plants, grid stations, and potentially water treatment facilities being systematically targeted, leading to weeks-long blackouts in Iran's major cities. A third possibility is further escalation from Iran. If its power plants are hit, Iran's retaliation options aren't limited. It could close the Strait of Hormuz again, or use regional proxies to widen the conflict even further. A fourth possibility is last-minute diplomacy. As has happened before, a third-party mediator like Pakistan, Qatar, or Oman could pull both sides back to the table before any deadline is reached. And this threat, too, could end up remaining just a threat. The honest truth is that no one can say with certainty which of these paths will play out. But the pattern over the last 5 months tells us one thing clearly. No ceasefire so far has lasted more than a few weeks. Up to this point, we focused on geopolitics and military strategy, but the biggest impact of this war falls on people who have no say in any of these decisions: ordinary Iranian civilians. According to Iran's health ministry, more than 35 people have died and over 300 have been injured since fighting resumed. That's not just a statistic. Behind each number is a family, a home, someone who has lost someone they loved. Similarly, when strikes intensify around the Strait of Hormuz, seafarers and port workers become part of this war without ever wearing a uniform. In the recent crisis, 12 seafarers were killed or went missing, and a port worker in Bahrain also lost his life. And if power plants are actually targeted, the first and hardest impact will fall on hospitals, the elderly, and children, the people who need reliable electricity the most. This is exactly why international humanitarian organizations keep repeating the same appeal. keep civilian infrastructure out of this war, no matter which side is responsible. One more angle that's often overlooked is the long-term economic fallout of this war, not just for Iran, but globally. Since the Strait of Hormuz crisis began, shipping companies have seen sharp increases in insurance premiums. Some have rerouted entirely, taking the much longer path around the Cape of Good Hope just to avoid the risk in the strait. That drives up transportation costs, and those costs eventually land on consumers, whether in Asia, Europe, or elsewhere. Countries that heavily depend on Gulf oil and gas for their energy needs, India, Japan, South Korea, and China among them, are particularly exposed. Fuel shortages don't just hit transportation, they ripple into manufacturing, agriculture, and the price of everyday essentials. Iran's own economy was already under severe strain from years of sanctions. If its power infrastructure is now destroyed as well, reconstruction could take years, deepening the humanitarian and economic crisis inside the country even further. Some economists have warned that if this conflict drags on much longer, its effects won't stay confined to the Middle East. Global inflation, stock markets, and energy policy will all feel the impact. That's exactly why it's not just diplomats watching this closely anymore, but finance ministers and central banks around the world too. Inside the United States itself, this escalating threat has not gone unchallenged. Lawmakers from both parties have raised questions about whether the executive branch has the authority to launch a full-scale campaign against another nation's civilian infrastructure without a formal declaration of war from Congress. Legal scholars have pointed out that even under the broadest interpretations of presidential war powers, deliberately destroying facilities whose primary function is civilian electricity generation sits in a very different legal category than striking a military base or a missile launch site. Human rights organizations have also weighed in, warning that any strike specifically aimed at crippling a nation's power grid, rather than degrading a specific military capability, could set a troubling precedent for how future conflicts are conducted around the world. Public reaction has been just as divided. Some see the threat as necessary leverage, arguing that Iran's repeated attacks on commercial shipping and its closure of a critical global waterway justify an aggressive response designed to force a real, lasting deal. Others see it as a dangerous overreach, one that risks turning a regional conflict into a much broader humanitarian catastrophe, with consequences that could last for a generation. On social media, the debate has played out in real time, with clips of CENTCOM's strike footage circulating alongside images from Iranian cities showing the aftermath of recent attacks. It's a stark reminder that in a modern war, the battlefield and the information space move at the same speed. There's also a broader historical pattern worth noting. Threats to target an adversary's power grid or civilian energy infrastructure are not new in modern warfare, but they are almost always among the most controversial decisions any military can make, precisely because the line between military pressure and collective punishment of a civilian population becomes extremely thin. Past conflicts where power infrastructure was deliberately targeted have often led to years of humanitarian fallout long after the fighting itself ended, with rebuilding efforts taking far longer than the military campaign that caused the damage in the first place. That history is part of why this particular threat, striking power plants specifically, carries so much more weight than a routine warning about further military strikes. It's also worth asking what happens diplomatically if this threshold is crossed. Countries that have so far stayed on the sidelines, offering only statements of concern, could face pressure to take a firmer stance. Regional alliances could shift. Oil-dependent economies that have already been absorbing higher energy costs for months could see those costs spike further, adding pressure on governments far from the Middle East to respond diplomatically or economically, whether through sanctions, emergency energy reserves, or renewed calls for a ceasefire at the United Nations Security Council. In many ways, a strike on Iran's power plants wouldn't just be the next chapter of this particular war. It could become a turning point that reshapes how the rest of the world responds to it. So to bring this all together, what we've covered today is not just a headline. This is a war that has been running since February 2026, one that saw a ceasefire form and collapse, an MOU get signed and then fail, and has now reached a point where the President of the United States is openly talking about targeting Iran's power plants and bridges, not just military bases. If this strike actually happens, its effects won't stay contained to Iran. Global oil prices, Asia's fuel supply, a potential humanitarian crisis, and the entire balance of power across the Middle East could all be shaken by this one decision. The real question now is this: is this just another pressure tactic, like the ones we've seen before, or will Trump actually follow through this time? Before we wrap up, it's worth stepping back and asking why this particular threat has generated so much attention compared to the dozens of strikes we've already seen over the past 5 months. Part of the answer is scale. A missile hitting a coastal radar station is a tactical strike, but a campaign against the power grid is a strategic one. aimed not at a military unit, but at the ability of an entire nation to function day to day. Part of the answer is precedent. Once civilian infrastructure becomes an accepted target in one conflict, it becomes harder to argue it shouldn't be a target in the next one anywhere in the world. And part of the answer is simply timing. This threat is landing at a moment when the ceasefire has already collapsed, when both sides have already crossed lines they hadn't crossed before, and when diplomatic channels appear thinner than at any point since the war began in February. That combination is exactly why analysts, journalists, and ordinary people across the region are watching the next few days so closely. A single decision, whether to pull back or to follow through, could determine whether this remains a contained, if brutal, regional conflict, or whether it becomes something the entire world has to reckon with for years to come. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you want detailed videos like this one covering every major update in this war, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. See you in the next video. Take care until then.